The city has already fallen. The screens are gone. The fires are dying. But for the women taken alive, the worst has not even begun. In the shadows of Roman conquest, captured noblewomen were not immediately sold. They were processed, measured, stripped of identity, prepared through methods so calculated, so normalized, that Roman writers recorded them without shame. This is not the Rome of marble temples and philosophers. This is the Rome of hidden chambers, silent rituals, and systems designed to break the human will before the auction even began. Tonight, you will discover what Roman slave dealers did to noblewomen before the torchlight sale, why history rarely teaches it, and how an entire civilization turned fear into profit. Watch carefully, because once you understand this system, you will never see ancient Rome the same way again. Kindly subscribe my channel, then start story. The night a city became merchandise, the walls of Corinth fell in hours, but the fate of its noblewomen stretched far beyond that night. When the fires died and the screams faded, a quieter, colder system took control. What followed was not chaos, but preparation. The year was 146 BCE, and Corinth, once one of the wealthiest cities in the Greek world, lay broken under Roman rule. Streets that had echoed with philosophy, trade, and ceremony were now filled with smoke, ash, and the disciplined movement of Roman soldiers. For most citizens, death had come quickly during the sack. For others, especially women of high birth, survival marked the beginning of something far worse. Rome did not simply conquer cities. It harvested them. Among those taken alive was Cleomesh, a 31-year-old noblewoman whose family had governed Corinth for generations. Only weeks earlier, she had walked marble halls, managed servants, and negotiated trade matters for her household. She spoke multiple languages, quoted Homer with ease, and believed, as many did, that status and education offered protection even in defeat. That belief died the moment Roman hands pulled her from her home. Roman conquest followed rules refined over centuries. Once resistance ended, the population became property of the Roman state. Soldiers were not free to act randomly. Officers issued orders. Valuable captives were identified immediately, separated from the rest, and guarded carefully. Noblewomen were assets, not spoils to be wasted. Their survival was an investment. Identification was swift and brutal in its simplicity. Fine clothing, jewelry, unmarked skin, confident posture, educated speech, all marked women like Cleomesh as high value. Within hours of capture, she and others like her were removed from the ruins and placed under military control. Children were taken from mothers without explanation. Families were divided according to market categories. No reasons were given, because reasons were unnecessary. After several days in military holding, Cleomesh was sold. The buyer was not a soldier, but a professional, a man whose business depended on conquest. His name was Gaius Varius Flaccus, a slave dealer with nearly 3 decades of experience. He did not see captives as enemies or victims. He saw inventory. He paid a large sum for Cleomesh and 11 other noblewomen, confident that careful preparation would multiply his investment. They were transported in covered carts, denied any sense of direction or distance. This was intentional. Disorientation weakened resistance and prevented captives from understanding where they were or planning escape. When Cleomesh arrived at the processing facility, she had not seen sunlight in many hours. She had not eaten properly. She had not seen her children in days. Uncertainty had already begun its work. The facility itself was not a dungeon in the popular imagination. It was organized, functional, and efficient. Stone chambers, bathing rooms, examination areas, and holding cells formed a sequence designed to transform free people into saleable property. Archaeology from places like Delos confirmed such layouts. This was not improvisation. It was industry. On her first day inside, Cleomesh was brought into an assessment chamber. She was ordered to remove her clothing and stand on cold stone while assistants recorded measurements on wax tablets. Height, weight, proportions, skin condition, hair, teeth, hands, nothing was overlooked. Roman law required sellers to disclose defects. Thorough inspection protected profit. The examination was clinical, silent, and deeply intentional. Her discomfort was irrelevant. As they worked, they watched her reactions closely. Did she hesitate? Did she resist? Did she avert her eyes or stand straight? Pride mattered. Pride reduced value. Flaccus noticed it immediately. He saw it in the way she held herself, in the controlled expression on her face. To him, this meant more work ahead. By nightfall, Cleomesh was placed in a small cell, alone. Isolation was not punishment. It was preparation. Over the next 3 days, her body would be altered, her identity denied, and her expectations reshaped. Rome did not rely on chains alone. It relied on systems that made obedience profitable. As the torches dimmed and the doors closed, Cleomesh still believed survival might bring answers, maybe even reunion. She did not yet understand that the process had already begun, and that the woman who would stand on the auction platform would no longer be the one who had watched Corinth fall. Measured, marked, and redefined, before chains were placed, numbers were written. Before obedience was taught, identity was erased. The first lesson was simple. Worth could be calculated. By the morning of the second day, Cleomesh understood that the warehouse was not a place of waiting, but a place of transformation. The silence was deliberate, broken only by footsteps and brief commands. She and the other women were taken one by one into rooms designed for evaluation, not unlike workshops. Nothing in these chambers suggested anger or cruelty. That absence was more frightening. Everything here existed to serve purpose, and that purpose was profit. The assessment began again, more detailed than before. Assistants returned with measuring cords, weights, and tablets already marked with symbols she did not understand. Her body was turned, positioned, examined under carefully angled torchlight meant to expose flaws. Scars were traced. Skin tone was evaluated. Even the way she stood was noted. Roman buyers preferred bodies that suggested health and compliance, not defiance. Every observation shaped what would be done to her next. This process was not unique to Corinth. Roman writers described it openly. Slave dealers were expected to know their merchandise intimately. A woman's education increased value. Her previous pregnancies were recorded, not with sympathy, but as indicators of fertility and resilience. Cleomesh felt herself reduced to data. Her memories, her grief, her fear were invisible. Only what could be sold mattered. After assessment came alteration. The bathing rooms were not places of comfort, but of stripping away. Warm water loosened dirt, while rough claws and pumice scraped skin raw. Oils followed, not to soothe, but to prepare. The message was clear. What had once been private was now subject to inspection and modification. This was not care. It was conditioning. Hair removal was next. Roman taste demanded a specific appearance, and paying was considered irrelevant. Razors scraped. Abrasives burned. Assistants worked efficiently, without cruelty, but without mercy. The discomfort was part of the lesson. Control over the body belonged to the owner, not the person inside it. Cleomesh learned quickly that resistance only prolonged the process. Cosmetics followed, chosen not to enhance her former beauty, but to reshape it into something Roman buyers expected. Her hair was styled in foreign fashion. Oils were rubbed into her skin until it reflected light unnaturally. She recognized her face less with each step. The woman in the polished bronze reflection looked Roman, not Greek, prepared not for life, but for display. Between procedures, she was taught how to move, how to stand, how to turn when instructed, how to lower her eyes. These were not suggestions. They were rehearsed behaviors enforced immediately. Compliance brought brief relief. Hesitation brought restraint. The system rewarded submission not with kindness, but with the absence of pain. That distinction mattered. Throughout the day, she heard sounds from beyond the walls, raised voices, sudden silence, the sharp intake of breath from another woman learning the cost of refusal. These sounds were not hidden. They were part of the environment, teaching without explanation. Cleomash understood that this was not about breaking bodies, but about shaping choices. By nightfall, she was returned to isolation. No name was spoken. She was a number now, a category, a future transaction. She tried to remember her children's faces, to anchor herself to something real, but exhaustion blurred thought. Rome did not need her to forget everything. It needed her to learn one thing clearly. Tomorrow, the process would move beyond the body. Tomorrow, they would begin teaching her who she was allowed to be. The silence that broke the will chains were not the first weapon used. Silence was. Because a woman who cannot speak her name begins to forget who she is. The third day began without announcement, without light, without voices calling her by name. Cleomash woke alone on stone, unsure how much time had passed, unsure whether it was morning or night. The cell was intentionally empty, designed to give her nothing to measure time against. This was not neglect. Roman slave dealers understood something essential about the human mind. Disorientation weakens resistance faster than pain. When the door opened, no one addressed her directly. She was gestured forward, like an object being moved between rooms. From this moment on, no assistant would acknowledge her as a person. No questions were answered. No explanations were offered. She was not Cleomash. She was not a wife, a mother, a citizen of Corinth. She was inventory awaiting final preparation. The psychological processing began with isolation intensified. She was separated entirely from the other noblewomen she had glimpsed earlier. No shared glances, no whispered words, no confirmation that others still existed. Roman sources described this stage calmly, noting that captives supported each other when allowed contact. Support reduced efficiency, so support was removed. Identity denial followed. When she tried to speak her name, the assistant did not react. When she mentioned her children, the response was a blank stare. Appeals to status, education, or former authority were ignored completely. It was as if those words no longer meant anything in this place. Over time, speaking became pointless. Silence replaced speech, not by force, but by futility. Tasks were introduced, simple but degrading. She was ordered to clean the floor of her own cell, to accept food placed on the ground, to respond to commands with specific gestures rather than words. These tasks served no practical need. The facility had servants. Their purpose was symbolic. Each action reinforced her new position in the hierarchy. Former nobility performing the lowest acts of service learned quickly where they now belonged. Uncertainty was carefully maintained. She was not told when she would be sold. She was not told where her children were. She was not told whether compliance would help her or whether resistance would doom her. This constant not knowing drained strength. Roman dealers understood that hope without clarity exhausted the mind. It forced captives to imagine outcomes worse than any truth. At intervals, she heard others being corrected. Not seen, but heard. The sound of raised voices. The abrupt end of resistance. The quiet that followed. No explanation accompanied these sounds. None was needed. The lesson was unmistakable. Resistance had consequences. Compliance brought silence. Throughout the day, she was brought out repeatedly, ordered to stand, to move, to lower her eyes under inspection. Buyers were not present yet, but preparation for their gaze had begun. She was learning how to exist under constant evaluation without reacting. Emotion, she discovered, was dangerous. Detachment offered protection. Something within her began to adapt. Not surrender, but calculation. She understood now that survival depended on appearing compliant, even when inwardly resisting. This realization did not feel like strength. It felt like loss. The parts of herself that had once demanded dignity learned to retreat, not because they were wrong, but because they were powerless here. By the end of the third day, the dealers would have called her market ready, her body prepared, her behavior predictable, her resistance quiet enough not to threaten value. Modern minds might call this the beginning of trauma. Roman merchants called it success. As she was led back to her cell for the final time, Cleomesh understood something devastatingly clear. The auction would not be the worst moment. The worst moment had already passed, when she learned that obedience was the only language this world recognized. And tomorrow, under torchlight, that obedience would be tested before strangers who would decide her fate with raised hands and spoken prices. A business built on broken lives. This was not cruelty born of chaos. It was regulated, recorded, and refined. Rome did not improvise suffering, it standardized it. By the fourth phase of preparation, Cleomesh was no longer treated as an individual case, but as a familiar pattern. Everything happening to her had happened to thousands before, and Roman sources prove it. Slave dealers like Gaius Varius Flaccus did not invent these methods themselves. They inherited them, learned them as apprentices, and passed them on as professional knowledge. What Cleomesh endured was not excess. It was best practice. Roman law recognized slaves as property, but property that required disclosure. Sellers were legally obligated to declare defects, illnesses, tendencies to escape, or resistance to discipline. Failure to do so could result in lawsuits after sale. This legal framework encouraged extreme thoroughness. Every aspect of a captive's body and behavior had to be tested, recorded, and corrected before auction. Preparation was not just cruelty. It was risk management. Cleomesh was brought again into the examination area, this time not to measure her body, but to evaluate her obedience. She was given instructions in clipped phrases. Stand, turn, walk, lower your eyes. Each command was observed carefully. Did she hesitate? Did she obey immediately? Did her face reveal resentment, fear, or indifference? Roman buyers paid more for slaves who appeared internally compliant, not merely physically restrained. The performance mattered. Around her, the facility continued its rhythm. Assistants moved efficiently, like craftsmen repeating familiar motions. Wax tablets were updated. Notes were exchanged. Decisions were made quietly. Cleomesh realized that her fate was being shaped by men who felt nothing toward her at all. Hatred would have been easier to endure. Indifference was worse. This stage also involved reputation construction. Dealers prepared the narrative that would accompany each woman at auction. Origin, education, skills, temperament. Cleomesh would be described as educated, multilingual, capable of managing a household. Her resistance would not be mentioned. The processing existed precisely to erase it. Rome did not sell broken slaves. It sold trained ones. What shocked modern historians most is how openly Roman writers discussed this system. There was no sense of shame. Authors compared slave preparation to agriculture, to animal breeding, to manufacturing. Human beings were inputs transformed into outputs. The language was clean. The reality was not. Cleomesh began to understand something chilling. Rome did not need to terrorize constantly. It needed only to demonstrate control once and then maintain it through structure. The routines, the silence, the rules, the uncertainty, all of it trained captives to police themselves. By the time the auction arrived, most resistance had already been priced out of existence. As the day progressed, she was exposed briefly to other captives again, not for comfort, but comparison. She saw women who had resisted longer, whose processing had been harsher, whose eyes no longer tracked movement properly. She also saw women who had adapted quickly, who moved smoothly, who responded instantly. The contrast was intentional. It showed her the spectrum of outcomes and where obedience led. By evening, Flaccus himself entered the chamber. He did not touch her. He did not threaten her. He simply observed. His gaze lingered, professional and detached. He nodded once. That nod meant she was ready. The investment had paid off. Cleomash was returned to her cell for the final night before auction. For the first time since her capture, she was given slightly more food and allowed to rest without interruption. This was not kindness. It was preservation. Tomorrow, she needed to look healthy, calm, valuable. As she lay in the darkness, she understood the full horror of what Rome had built. Not a system of chains and whips alone, but a machine that turned fear, hope, and adaptation into profit. And tomorrow, under the bright torches of the auction platform, that machine would deliver its finished product to the highest bidder. Sold under torchlight, the chains were polished not to restrain, but to present. Voices rose, numbers climbed, and silence became obedience. This was the moment Rome called fair trade. Dawn broke over Corinth's ruined agora, but nothing about the auction felt new. Temporary platforms had been erected where philosophers once debated and merchants once bargained. Torches burned even in daylight, positioned carefully to cast flattering light and conceal imperfections. The market had been transformed into a stage, and Cleomash was led onto it as part of the final display. She stood among other women, each positioned according to perceived value. Spacing was deliberate. Those expected to sell for less were placed closer together. High-value captives like Cleomash were given space, visibility, room to be examined from every angle. Around her neck hung the titulus, a wooden placard listing her origin, age, skills, and guarantees. It did not mention her name. It did not mention her children. It listed only what Rome believed mattered. Buyers arrived early. Senators' agents, wealthy merchants, household managers for elite families. They moved calmly through the rows, inspecting merchandise with the same detachment used to examine livestock or textiles. Cleomash felt hands lift her chin, fingers press against her arms, eyes trace her posture. She complied automatically. Resistance would lower value. She had learned that lesson well. The auctioneer's voice carried across the square, practiced and persuasive. Each lot was introduced with confident assurance. Bidding began low and rose quickly as competition revealed interest. Cleomash listened as numbers were called out, each one translating her future into currency. 8,000, 9,000, 10,000. Each increase tightened the silence inside her. She noticed something unsettling. Buyers were not bidding on beauty alone. They watched how she responded, how quickly she turned when directed, whether her eyes showed defiance or blank acceptance. Compliance had become part of the product. The processing had worked. What they saw was a woman already shaped for ownership. The highest bids came from men who did not step forward themselves. They sent representatives. Distance preserved dignity. Ownership did not require personal involvement. When the final bid was called, the decision was immediate. A nod, a confirmation. 12,000 denarii. The hammer fell. Applause was unnecessary. The transaction was complete. Cleomash was removed from the platform at once. There was no farewell to the other women, no acknowledgement of the crowd. She was handed to the household agent of her new owner, a Roman senator whose name she heard only in passing. From this moment on, she belonged not to the market, but to a household she had never seen. Around her, the auction continued. Other women were sold. Some fetched high prices, others less. Each outcome reflected how thoroughly the system had done its work. Rome rewarded preparation. Rome punished resistance. The market was the final proof of value. As she was led away, Cleomash felt something unexpected. Not relief, but emptiness. The fear of the unknown had been replaced by certainty of ownership. Her future was no longer abstract. It was decided, purchased, recorded. Behind her, the torches continued to burn. Voices continued to rise. Another generation of noblewomen was being converted into assets. Rome did not pause to reflect. It never had. As the carts began their journey toward Rome, Cleomesh looked once more at the city where her life had ended and another had been sold into existence. She did not know what awaited her in her new master's household. She did not know whether obedience would bring safety or simply prolong suffering. What she did not yet understand was that her story, brutal as it was, represented only one outcome of this system. And in the shadows of Rome's prosperity, countless others would vanish without record, their fates darker still, waiting beyond the auction's bright torchlight. What Rome chose to forget, the records survived. The stones remained, only the voices were buried. History remembered Rome's power, but not its price. Cleomesh's journey ended far from Corinth, inside a Roman household that valued order, silence, and efficiency. She was given new clothing, new duties, and a new name chosen for convenience rather than meaning. The household praised her obedience and intelligence, unaware or uninterested in how those traits had been manufactured. To them, she was a successful purchase, proof that the market worked as intended. Roman society congratulated itself on civilization. Its writers celebrated law, architecture, and philosophy, while slavery was described as necessity, tradition, or fate. The same men who debated virtue in marble halls invested in systems that erased it in practice. This contradiction was not hidden at the time. It was normalized. Roman authors wrote openly about slave markets, processing techniques, and pricing structures because they saw no moral conflict. Slavery was infrastructure. What makes this history unsettling is not only the suffering, but its organization. The pain Cleomesh endured was not accidental or excessive. It was calculated. Every stage existed to increase value and reduce risk. Psychological destruction was cheaper than constant physical restraint. Compliance was more profitable than terror. Rome learned this early and refined it relentlessly. Archaeological remains confirm what texts describe. Chains sized for display rather than confinement. Bathing rooms designed for mass processing. Inscriptions recording transactions without names, only origins and prices. These fragments tell a consistent story. Rome's greatness rested on systems that transformed human lives into commodities with chilling efficiency. Cleomesh survived. Many did not. Some women resisted longer and were marked as difficult, sold cheaply into harsher labor. Others broke quickly and disappeared into households without record. Children vanished into separate markets, their identities erased before memory could fully form. The Roman economy absorbed them all, converting conquest into wealth and silence. Modern history often softens this reality. Textbooks speak of slavery in abstract terms, emphasizing scale over experience. They discuss numbers, not processes. They describe outcomes, not methods. What happened inside the processing facilities is rarely taught because it complicates the narrative of Rome as a foundation of Western values. But the sources are there: Roman legal texts, poetic references, archaeological layouts. They reveal a truth that cannot be dismissed as rumor or exaggeration. Rome knew exactly what it was doing. It wrote it down. It regulated it. It profited from it. Cleomesh's name survives only because historians can reconstruct her story from patterns repeated thousands of times. For every woman like her, countless others remain unnamed, reduced to figures on tablets long since lost. Their suffering built estates, funded temples, and sustained an empire that still shapes how the world understands power. The question history leaves us with is not whether Rome was cruel. It is whether cruelty, when systematized and rewarded, becomes invisible. Rome did not hide its slave trade because it was ashamed. It hid it because it was normal. And when we admire the ruins, the roads, the laws, we are also standing on the remains of lives processed, priced, and erased. Civilization advanced, but not without cost. The silence of women like Cleomash is part of that foundation. To remember this is uncomfortable. That is why it is necessary.